We're reading from Genesis 20, verses 1 through 8, out of the New International Version. Now Abraham moved on from there into the region of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. For a while he stayed in Gerar, and there Abraham said of his wife Sarah, "She is my sister." Then Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent for Sarah and took her. But God came to Abimelech in a dream one night and said to him, "You are as good as dead because of the woman you have taken. She is a married woman." Now Abimelech had not gone near her, so he said, "Lord, will you destroy an innocent nation? Did he not say to me, 'She is my sister'? And didn't she also say, 'He is my brother'? I have done this with a clear conscience and clean hands." Then God said to him in the dream, "Yes, I know you did this with a clear conscience, and so I have kept you from sinning against me. That is why I did not let you touch her. Now return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you will live. But if you do not return her, you may be sure that you and all who belong to you will die." Early the next morning, Abimelech summoned all his officials, and when he told them all that had happened, they were very much afraid.
If you would, please be. Good morning. I am so glad that we can be together today and experience God's creation. Changed it up on us today. We're a little cooler and windier, and I don't know, I like it. It feels good. We are continuing in our series on Abraham and looking at this idea of his faith and how it is so much like our faith in the way in which we walk with our God. I want you to think for just a moment, are there certain moments in your life that you thought, "Oh man, that's behind me. I'm glad that that's behind me. I don't have to deal with that anymore." And then it's like it pops back up. You didn't expect it, and it's like, wait a minute. I thought I had learned my lesson. I thought that it was over and done. And maybe it's moments that, maybe it's like a reaction to a particular situation or a choice that feels very familiar but in the worst kind of way. It's not so much that, and it is, that there's that failure moment where, I messed up, but there's confusion that goes along with it, I think. Because in those moments, it's not just, let me put it this way, we don't mess up when we're far away from God all the time. There are times where we mess up and we're walking right with God. And it's that challenge for us to go, okay, well, wait a minute. How did this happen? How did I return to that same place even when I know better? The reality is that there is something deeper underneath of those repeated moments. It's not just a habit, and it's not just weakness. It is the element of fear. It's the fear that grips us and leads us to protect ourselves, even in the very moments when we know that we should be trusting God. As we come to Genesis 20, we find Abraham in that similar situation. He is a man who knows God. He is a man who has heard His voice. He is a man who is inside God's promise. And yet he is about to do something that we've seen before. And so the question that comes with this chapter, I believe, is why does fear still control someone who knows God? And maybe more personally in this is, where does that same fear still reside in you and me? So as we think about this chapter, if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Genesis 20. We're going to see something familiar in this chapter. Abraham is going to pick up his tents, and he's going to travel south to the Negev. And he's going to sort of come into this area. We're not exactly sure where Gerar is, but it's somewhere in that area. And so he enters this new region, he settles among new people, and he begins to live this new life, or begins to live life in a new place. And that's when our text just matter-of-factly states that Abraham says of Sarah, she's my sister. There's not really much explanation that's given here in this text. It doesn't seem to be any sense of urgency. It's just a statement. The reality is we've heard this before. When Abraham went to Egypt, he did this exact same thing. He said to the Egyptians, he said to Pharaoh, oh yeah, Sarah's my sister. But this time there doesn't seem to be any clear threat. There's no confrontation. It seems like he just simply returns to this way of reasoning. And it feels like that everything is sort of just the same as it was before. And so it asks, here's this man who has heard God speak. He's seen him provide. He has developed this relationship with God. And yet, we find ourselves asking the question, why does this thing keep happening in someone who knows God? Well, if we follow the chapter, what we see is, in some ways, Abraham is rewriting the truth. Because think about it, if you continue to do the same thing, you're going to get similar results. And so what we see here is he is in a new region. He tells them, hey, this is my sister. And so Abimelech, I'm going to call him Avimelech because the B's are V's in the Hebrew there. So Avimelech is king of Gerar, and he sees Sarah and he takes her because he thinks, okay, she's the sister of Abraham. Which should tell us something, just as a side note, about the beauty of Sarah. Because at this time, she's probably around 90 years old. And again, the king sees her, just like Pharaoh did, and says, oh, I want you to be in my household. And it's only when Abimelech finds out the truth and confronts Abraham do we see the real problem. We see Abimelech gives a question. As he takes Sarah, he asks the question of Abraham. When he knows that Sarah is his wife, he says, what have you done to us? Which forces Abraham to explain his situation, to explain not only the what, but the why. And what we find is Abraham's deception wasn't just towards the king, it has an impact on the king's entire kingdom. Abimelech presses him further. And he actually says, what did you see? And I think the reference there is, what did you see in my kingdom that made you do this thing? And the picture that we have is that Abraham then reveals his assumption. And he says, well, I thought that there was no fear of God in this place. He didn't know these people. They hadn't been a threat to him, and yet he goes ahead and he assumes the worst. He isn't reacting to what is. He's reacting to what he fears could be. In his mind, this seems to be a dangerous place. People can't be trusted. And if he tells the truth, it will cost him. And so he acts not based on reality, but based on fear. And we're shown there in verse 12 that he goes further, and what he says is, well, let me use the truth for self-protection. Because he goes on and he says, well, she really is my sister. Even after being found out, he says, well, she really is my sister. Technically true. But he is using that to mislead and to justify his actions. Here's the thing that we see in that. Fear doesn't always lead us to outright lies. More often, it leads us to reshape the truth. We say what feels safe and we leave off the part that feels risky. We justify so that it can help us stay in control. And if you notice at verse 13 then, Abraham almost sort of doubles down on this and he says, well, this is what we've always done. He goes on and he says, from the time that God has called me to wander throughout all this area, I've said, hey, Sarah, the way that you can show kindness to me is if when we go anywhere, you just tell them you are my sister. Which means this wasn't something that he just came up with. This was how it was built into him, how he responded when things felt uncertain. Which means that this is a pattern. It is something that has been shaping him for a long time. And so when we step back and you look and you see the assumptions that he was making, the half-truth, the repeated pattern, it all comes from the same place. Fear. Fear is what is driving Abraham. It isn't loud, obvious fear. It's that quiet fear that takes hold, not of our entire life, but it takes hold of certain areas in our lives. It tells us that we need to protect ourselves. It makes us feel like in the moment, trusting God isn't enough. I've got to do something on my own so that I can feel safe. Notice with Abraham, he trusts God with the promise, but not with the situation in front of him. He sort of says, God, you can handle the big things, okay? Yeah, this whole promise you're going to give me, you're going to make me this great nation and all this, you can handle that. But in the moment, he's saying, I don't trust you enough to let you handle it. I've got to do something to make it work. You see, when fear takes that place, it doesn't just affect what we do. It shapes how we think, how we interpret, and how we decide to live. Well, if that is Abraham, then let's go back and let's look a little bit deeper at Avimelech as we think about the unexpected mirror. And what we're going to find here is this, really it's a reversal of character. Because we're told Avimelech takes Sarah, and then God comes to Avimelech in a dream. And God says, you're a dead man for taking Sarah. How's that for a nightmare? The creator of the universe is coming to you and he just says, you are going to die because of what you did. But what the text tells us is Avimelech didn't do it on bad pretenses. I mean, he actually says, well, hold on, wait a minute. He says, are you going to murder a nation that is righteous. That should draw us back to Abraham talking with God on behalf of Sodom. When he was talking with us and saying, are you going to wipe out all this city if there are 50 righteous? And so here's Abimelech saying the same thing, and he goes on and he says, hold on. Both Abraham and Sarah, they both told me that they're brother and sister. And so he says, I did this out of the blamelessness of my heart. And Yahweh acknowledges that. He says, I know you did this out of the blamelessness of your heart. And then Yahweh takes it a step further and he says, I'm actually the one who was preventing you from coming near Sarah. So he knows this man and his heart. And what we see is the man outside the promise is being called innocent, while the man inside the promise is the one who is causing the problem. Abimelech didn't know. He didn't act wickedly. He responds with a fear of God. In contrast to Abraham, who knows God, is the one who is acting out of fear. And we see then in verse 8 that Abimelech responds with integrity. He wakes up, he tells his servants about his conversation with Yahweh. They're all afraid. And then he confronts Abraham directly and honestly. He's not trying to manipulate the situation. There's no retaliation. It's just clarity and integrity. And what we see is the one Abraham had assumed had no fear of God is the one who ends up acting like God's chosen one is supposed to act. You see, Abimelech becomes the mirror for Abraham. Abraham had assumed the worst, but Abimelech demonstrates something better. Abraham's fear didn't just lead him to act wrongly, it impacted how he saw the situation, how he saw everything. Because he misjudged the situation, he misjudged the people, and he acts based on that distortion. You see, fear shapes both his actions and his vision. And as we go on, what we see is that God doesn't directly correct Abraham. He allows Abimelech to be the one to confront him. Which means sometimes God reveals what's in us through people we didn't expect to hear it from. Sometimes it might be those who aren't closest to us. Those who we may not look up to. Sometimes it comes from those outsiders. Sometimes it may even come from uncomfortable voices. But the issue isn't who it's coming from. The issue is, are we willing to hear it? Being close to God's promise didn't keep Abraham from living out of fear. Well, what we see next is that God steps in where faith fails. We'll pick up the reading there in verse 14. Abimelech then took sheep and oxen and male and female servants and gave them to Abraham and restored his wife Sarah to him. Abimelech said, "Behold, my land is before you. Settle wherever you please, or wherever it seems good to you," might be a translation. Verse 16, to Sarah he said, "Behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Behold, it is your vindication. Before all who are with you, and before all men, you are cleared." Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Avimelech and his wife and his maids, so that they bore children. For Yahweh had closed fast all the wombs of the household of Avimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. Notice what we see here, and that is that God protects the promise. Avimelech returns Sarah. He gives gifts to Abraham, very much like what we see back with Pharaoh in Egypt. He offers Abraham, he says, "You can dwell in my land." He says, "You dwell wherever your eye seems that it is good." And then he publicly clears Sarah's name. The wording that is given there, a literal translation is, let's say this is a covering of the eyes. What Avimelech is saying is like, hey, let's pretend like this never happened. I've given your brother, notice he calls him brother, he doesn't call him husband. I'm giving your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Okay, I am trying to make this right. And he publicly declares, your reputation is intact. Nothing happened. You still are pure, if you will. But think about what could have gone wrong. The promise could have been at risk. The future of Isaac could have been in danger. Everything that Abraham did put the promise in danger, and yet the promise is still standing. Abraham acting in that fear could have derailed everything, but it didn't. Not because Abraham fixed the situation, but because God intervened. And notice this, God still works through Abraham. God tells Avimelech in the dream, this man, Abraham, is a prophet. He will pray for you, and it will bring life to you. He then prays, as we just read, and all of the wombs of Avimelech's household are now healed so that they can have children. The one who caused the problem becomes the one God uses in restoration. So that God does not discard Abraham because of his failure. Instead, he works through him. It's not that he waits on Abraham to prove himself. Abraham doesn't earn his way back. It is Yahweh there saying, I'm moving toward you, Abraham, even in your mess. Which shows us the deeper reality of God's faithfulness. You see, Abraham failed. Fear shaped his actions. The situation spiraled yet again because of what he was doing, and still God's faithfulness reached into the very place where our faith falls short. You can say Abraham failed, but how many times do we fail? At that same sin that keeps coming up and up and up over again, and we still keep giving into it. But here's the thing, Jesus never acts out of fear. He never distorts the truth. And he fully entrusts himself to his Father. Jesus is the faithful one Abraham could not be. And he is the one that we are being molded into. So let's just think for a moment then, what's the application for us? Well, when we live in fear, start by looking for the pattern. Where does this show up repeatedly? What are the things that you have going on in your life right now that you're saying, I just can't seem to shake this. I keep going back and giving in to this sin over and over. And then expose that fear. Ask yourself, what am I afraid of losing? What am I trying to protect? There's something that I'm wanting to hold on to. There's some reason why I cannot trust God, and instead I'm going and operating out of fear. What is that? See the distortion. Where has fear shaped how you see situations and people? Because just like Abraham, it's very easy for us to think, oh, well, this is what's going to happen because of X, Y, and Z. It hadn't happened yet, but in our minds, we get that perspective and we think that's the course of action. That's the way it's going to happen. See how fear distorts our view. And then realize God's faithfulness. So many times I think, oh, well, that's where God's pulling away. And the reality is, He's not abandoning us in those situations. That is exactly where He is working in our lives. Where we struggle the most, that's where He says, that's where you can grow. And then move towards trust. Our faith grows when we entrust those areas to God. When we release our need to stay in control. And that's probably the real underlying problem, is that you and I want to stay in control. We want to hold on. We want to manipulate the situation to make it so that it will be best for us. And the reality is, you and I are not in control. Amen. We think we are. But if we would just allow God, who is in control, to handle the situation. And I can say over and over again in my life, how many times I sort of push God away and say, oh, no, I got this. Or at least I think I got it. And I make such a blunder of things. If I had only just let God take control. You see, it's not a matter of whether or not fear is in our lives. You and I have some element of fear in some aspect of our life. It's there. The question is whether we will continue to let fear lead us or not. You see, Genesis 20 is reality for us. Because it shows us that even when someone walks with God, there are still places where fear is going to speak louder than our faith. But God does not abandon Abraham in his failure, and He will not abandon you and I in our failures. Because God's faithfulness reaches to that very place where we are struggling the most, where our trust is at that point where we keep telling God, I just can't. I just can't trust you right now. God says, okay, let's walk through that together so that you can get to a point in that aspect of your life where you can trust me. But we have to be open with ourselves, and we have to be open with Yahweh. Not to rely upon ourselves, but to allow Yahweh to work in our lives. Because He is in control, and He has your best interest at heart. It's really easy when we operate out of fear to think, oh, God's going to be really mad at me right now. And we put distance between God and us when we fail. But think about a little kid who makes a mistake or who really just goes off the rails. It's not that the parents say, oh, well, done with you, kid. No. The parents are there saying, let's work through this. Let's walk through this together. And that's what Yahweh is saying to Abraham, and that's what Yahweh is saying to you and to me. Trust me, not in yourself. Look to Jesus as our mirror. Look to His life. Look to the power that He has over all creation. Look to the way that He entrusts Himself fully to the Father. So that as we follow Him, fear will still be present, but it won't be leading us down our path. This morning, what fear is holding you back? Is it a fear of not being in control? Is it a fear of holding on to things that you want versus the things that Yahweh wants? He's calling you to something better. If you've never known Him, if you've never given your life to Him, He's calling you. He's saying, would you trust me to be your Savior, to be your King, to be your friend? Because I've died for you so that you can have forgiveness of sin. But we have to be willing. We have to be willing to let ourselves submit to His lordship. And through baptism, we are a new creation. Maybe you are that new creation this morning. But maybe fear is holding you onto you. Maybe it's got a grip in a certain part of your life, and God is just trying to say, hey, let go. I'm trying to break the hold of that fear. Do you need prayers this morning? We're here, not because we're perfect, but because we're all people who are in fear and we're trying to hold on. But God says we can all do it together. That's His call this morning. If you are in any need, won't you come as together we stand and sing.